while attention has focused on the Kakhovka Dam disaster in Ukraine this week, the long-heralded counter-offensive has been underway for a few days now. There's an awful lot riding on it. Ukraine is committing a carefully husbanded reserve of units trained and equipped by the West, hoping to free large tracts of occupied territory. Unsurprisingly, given the stakes, President Zelensky's government has been tight-lipped about it, with one or two officials even claiming it hadn't started. But events on the battlefield show us clearly that it has. A rude reminder in Kherson today of that wider war coming to a key phase. People trying to rescue those stranded by the flooding coming under Russian artillery fire. If the flooding has achieved anything of military value, it's to deny the Ukrainians a possible route of advance south of the Dnipro. It's moot whether they ever planned to do that, but attention anyway is now fixed further east. The key fighting of the counteroffensive launched at the start of this week is an attempt to drive southwards towards Melitopol in this area between Zaporizhia and Vuhledar, and also fighting around Bakhmut in the northeast.
By accusing him of being a Russian spy.
Well, let's remember his name actually, because, well, it's not a trivial deal to murder your own negotiator. Denis Kireev.
Yes, Kireev, exactly. In any case, I think this, what it looked like was that basically Putin had prepared a new fraternal anti-fascist government with like Medvedchuk and Tsarev and whatever. The Ukrainians agreed to negotiations. During these negotiations, they were shown a preliminary document that would have included those things I talked about. But someone didn't like that. They ended up killing their own negotiator, and Russia entered a new phase of the war. I believe that at this point there was a conflict with Lukashenko, because he was probably promised like that it would be an operation like in Kazakhstan, but it ended up being a real war, and he was not ready for a real war. And I think after they probably considered Belarus entering the war, but Lukashenko didn't want to get involved anymore than he was at that point. And that, of course, automatically made the Kiev front useless. Like, there was no point in staying there. And if you look at what forces there were going in, you had like Chechen Spetsnaz and paratroopers on BMDs. These were not forces that were supposed to storm a city. So I assume that an assault on Kiev wasn't planned even theoretically. Like, after the negotiations had ended, there was no point in keeping troops there. What's also interesting is if you look at the sequence of events. You had the negotiations, then you had Medinsky from the Russian negotiation team announcing the gesture of goodwill, namely leaving Kiev and Chernihiv and Sumy. After that, the Ukrainians enter. I'm actually not sure if I can say this out loud in the way I want it to sound without us suffering consequences and the video getting deleted or whatever. The Ukrainians enter a town that starts with B and has been mentioned a lot in the media, and they stage a formal reason to not to negotiate with Russia. And I think this sequence of events makes the most sense.
And SBU also killed the negotiator.
Yes. So basically, at the same time, they kill the negotiator. Then they do a little butchery, and so they have a public reason for why they won't negotiate anymore. When actually it was, I don't know, either the Americans or the British or whoever telling them. You had, of course, Johnson coming to Kiev too. And then a bit later, you also had the missile strike in Kramatorsk, where like 50 civilians were killed with Tochka U.
Yeah, right.
And just to cement that Russia is bad and evil, and you aren't actually allowed to negotiate with them. And so that's what it looks like to me most logically that there was a peace plan that would have actually worked and would have been okay for both Russia and Ukraine, but in the end it didn't work, and Ukraine did some things to really make sure that there's no way back to the negotiating table. And at that point, Russia also slowly started treating it more as a war than as a police action.
Actually, we didn't know the contents of the negotiation in Minsk. It was, publicly revealed only now by Lukashenko. Так, слышно?
Да, слышно.
And it fits the character of Putin and Lukashenko also much more accurately, that Putin started the special military operation as a kind of to frighten the Ukrainian elite and not start a real war. It's completely believable that he offered to lease Crimea from Ukraine and also reintegrate Donbass.
Yeah, absolutely, it would make sense.
It fits, the whole Kremlin policy on the matter in the last 10 years. So,
in that sense, I've already said this also many times. In that sense, from a strategic, decade or century point of view, as tragic as the war is, it is in Russia's long-term geostrategic interest that this peace deal did not happen. Because I firmly believe that had it happened, and if we had pushed Donbass back into Ukraine and installed Medvedchuk and Tsaryov,
50 years from now, we would have another war.
And the exact same thing, probably from a much worse starting position. I mean, can you just imagine it? Like Oleg Tsaryov holds a speech on the Maidan and announces in Ukrainian language the new neutral anti-fascist government of fraternal Ukraine. On his right hand stands Aristovich in a vyshyvanka and with a St. George ribbon on his chest. Behind him, Medvedchuk standing back and looking important in a Brioni suit. Pushilin, still hungover and with a red and puffed up face, reads a speech about the Donetsk People's Republic finally being able to return to their Ukrainian homeland. The horror, the sheer horror of it.
Well, I wonder what would be the average reaction from the Ukrainian citizen to flee from the country to Europe, even more so than they did before, or to stay in the schizo-Eurasianist Ukrainian paradigm of a fraternal nation. What would they do? Or maybe create an underground of angry Banderites and the movement would grow millions wide.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I think most people would just chill out if the bombs stop falling on their heads, because I do believe that one of the main things that makes Ukrainians so susceptible to propaganda, to the most stupid propaganda you could imagine, and they actually believe it, is that they are held in a constant state of stress. In a constant state of air raid alarms, explosions, and the Ukrainians constantly turn on the air raid alarms, even when there's nothing happening. I think just to stop people from relaxing for a moment and talking and thinking about things. And when people are very stressed, they are much more susceptible to all sorts of influences. And as such, I think that if the war had stopped and it had turned into an actual counterinsurgency police operation against the Banderite underground, it would have been much more calm. And it's very hard to get people to actually drop everything and leave if there is no imminent threat to their life.
Kremlin got overconfident after their successful involvement in Kazakhstan in January.
Now, in retrospect, it's obvious that it was a trial run.
They managed to do that in Kazakhstan to crush their upcoming rebellion and all that. We, as you probably remember, were not the believers. We didn't think that Putin will actually announce war. And right there and then, it seemed like it was a great mistake, right? The Western media knew that it would happen, and we didn't believe it. But actually, it was a very uncanny situation. We knew how Putin operates, basically. And knowing now that he started the special military operation just to negotiate to lease Crimea and to return Donbass to Ukraine makes much more sense. Because I think the general perception was that Putin started a real war from the get-go.
Yeah.
And he did not, as we now realize. So we were kind of right, but it was a bluff that led us to a real war in the end. Very interesting. As Lukashenko himself said, he still wishes to start the peace process. He's the most peaceful man on this planet. The quote, "If we agree to a peace process, the war stops. No movements, no tanks, no troops. If anyone is redeployed, I believe we should use nuclear weapons. That is the only way we can talk to them." So recently, like a month ago, nuclear weapons were stationed in Belarus. Do you think it will be a Chekhov's gun in any way?
Well, I think it's mostly for two things: to cement the status of Belarus as a firm Russian ally, and it's much harder to like do stuff in a nuclear-armed country. Just to start a color revolution in a nuclear-armed country, it's a gamble that is very dangerous. And the second thing is to dissuade Poland from doing stupid things in Belarus too.
Well, in any case, the summer will be quite interesting, I think. So I guess this is it for a quick update on the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Thank you for listening and see you very soon.